Thank you for your nice introduction. For Germans, commemorating the Holocaust, the darkest chapter in their history, has remained difficult as anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and debates about appropriate Holocaust representations have lingered on. Nonetheless, since the 1940s, composers have steadily offered Holocaust tributes, ranging from documentarist to oblique and from traditional to experimental approaches. I will trace German composers who created Holocaust-inspired music before and after the Cold War and explore why they decided to memorialize this Jewish genocide and how they approached this task. I focus on Katzer's Aide Mémoire, Reimann's Kumiori, and Hegenbarth's and Strebel's 9/11, 1938. The history of German musical Holocaust memorials has to be understood against its political background. In West Germany, initial denazification and re-education efforts were largely futile and hampered by steps to integrate former Nazis. Guilt and responsibility were mostly suppressed through the 1950s. Unable to mourn, many Germans adopted the victim's role, feeling that Hitler had misguided them. Thus, few German composers conceived Holocaust-based works in the 1940s, and these are names of German composers based on the list compiled by Sophie Fettauer, but not limited to that information. Premiered in West and East Germany in the 1950s, Schönberg's A Survivor from Warsaw became the best-known early musical Holocaust response and was followed by the 1961 Jüdische Chronik, a reaction to anti-Semitism by 6 East and West German artists. In the 1960s and 1970s, public debates about the Eichmann and Auschwitz trials, Hannah Arendt's book Eichmann in Jerusalem, and plays by Rolf Hochhuth and Peter Weiss became the background for Holocaust-inspired music by such West Germans as Peter Ruzicka, Alice Samter, and Walter Steffens. In East Germany, post-war anti-fascist cleansing and public denunciations of anti-Semitism soon gave way to Stalinist style and anti-Semitic and anti-Israel politics. Viewing Nazism as a form of capitalism, the GDR rejected the Nazi era as part of its past and honored Nazi resistance fighters regardless of their race. In the 1950s and 60s, East German composers, among them Dessau, Eisler, and Medeck and Wagner Regeni, composed Holocaust-inspired works, underscoring the communist state's anti-fascist politics. The 1970s and 80s saw both East and West German composers produce such music against the backdrop of Chancellor Brandt's and Schmidt's symbolic gestures at commemorative events, Weiss's publication of Ästhetik des Widerstands, and the Historians' Dispute. Despite the reunification, Germany's relationship to the Holocaust has remained ambivalent, as seen in the Goldhagen, Walser-Bubis, and Möllermann debates. Yet old and such young composers as Maria Baptist, Hegenbarth, and Strebel have provided Holocaust-based works. Depending on their ideological milieu, composers attach different meanings to the Holocaust. In the GDR, composers tended to commemorate anti-fascist resistance fighters serving communism rather than the memory of murdered Jews. In the Cold War FRG, composers subtly addressed the Holocaust to avoid an aestheticization of terror. Holocaust pieces generally fall in two categories: explicit realist or dramatically realist tributes presenting specific or imagined events in a narrative style, and implicit anti-realist memorials using abstraction. And here I use some of the terminology suggested by Matthias Lehmann, the explicit-implicit dichotomy, and then also terminology suggested by art historians in the United States, including Dora Apel. Unlike their colleagues abroad, German composers favored implicit tributes before and after the Cold War, often setting text by Holocaust survivors Paul Celan, Primo Levi, and Nelly Sachs, or using Old Testament and symbolic references to the Holocaust. Holocaust compositions reveal wide-ranging styles. Yet while most FRG composers shunned the conventional styles sanctioned by the Nazis and built on formally degenerate approaches, GDR composers often followed the prescribed social realist maxim, preferring traditional rather than novel techniques, which the state deemed formalist and decadent, although, as we shall see, there were exceptions. Created by GDR composer Georg Katzer in 1983, Aide-Mémoire is a provocative Cold War-era example of a Holocaust memorial. The 14-minute collage from Nazi-era broadcasts was a commission from Radio GDR2 on the 50th anniversary of the Nazi book burnings. Long obsessed with such a piece, Katzer, an electronic music pioneer, born during the Hitler era, combined this experience with the idea of, quote, grasping this period as a terrible dream, end quote, to create, as emphasized by the title, Memory Aid, a reminder. Each of the 7 parts chronologically recounts Nazi-era events through an ever more unsettling soundscape. Sampled and processed materials are juxtaposed and interspersed by purely electronic sounds. Katzer borrowed casual talk and speeches by Nazi freedom fighters and Thomas Mann. He used Schubert's Der Lindenbaum, arranged by Silcher, Strauss's Arabella, premiered in 1933, and the much misused Beethoven Ninth and Liszt Les Préludes. He drew on popular songs, including Nur bei uns gibt's Gemütlichkeit, and wove in such military music as Hitler's favorite Badenweiler March. He used the war songs Volk ans Gewehr and Engeland-Lied, sung during the Nazi invasions, and at the end, a Soviet soldier song. But Katzer also used an ancient Jewish song, the Pietbog soldier song from the Bürgermoor concentration camp, and his own Miserere. The piece segues from careless sonorities to ominous military sounds and Nazi propaganda, and we will hear now an excerpt.
Denn meine Sorgen heißt bis morgen.
At its center, a Jewish song, Beethoven and Katzer's Miserere are drowned out by anti-Semitic rants and the crescendo sound of gas. We will hear it's a very disconcerting excerpt, actually.
Die Juden sind schuld, die Juden sind schuld.
Juda, ist der Feind! Wir warten es ab, ehe mit ihm abreißt. Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa! Der Jud muss raus! So oder so! Zum Sitzbereich steht keiner! Menschen sind wir Rasse und Parasiten in Menschengestalt, nach inneren Materien, Werken, unbedingt abbleiben, Synagogen, Laufrepubliken, da seine Gemeinheiten
Then follow Hitler's call for a total war, singing Soviet soldiers, and finally Thomas Mann critiquing the German support of the Judeocide. Quote, the great Hitler wouldn't have come if the little Hitlers hadn't stood by his side, end quote. Like Schönberg's Survivor and Dessau's Jüdische Chronik, Aide-Mémoire falls in the category of explicit documentarist Holocaust tributes. Yet despite its archival documents, Katzer's approach is far from being realistic. His casting of the clips as, quote, 7 nightmares from a 1,000-year night, between which the sleeper can find no rest, end quote, points to traumatic realism due to the juxtaposition of ordinary and peculiar elements, including sounds resulting from tape manipulation and electronic sounds. Despite Katzer's use of a Soviet army song evoking the Soviets as liberators and new suppressors, the piece is unusual in the East European Holocaust commemoration context, because Jewish suffering is the focus. The work also exposes Nazi propaganda and the German people's guilt, avoiding a redemptive conclusion. Aide-Mémoire is one of few electroacoustic pieces addressing the Holocaust and a rarity in GDR music, as electronic music was seen as inhumane and formalist. Aide was, despite severe criticism, first broadcast in 1983 and performed, recorded, and choreographed to critical acclaim thereafter. Aribert Reimann's song cycle Kumi Ori for baritone and orchestra demonstrates the fascination of many German composers with the Jewish poet Paul Celan, who was severely affected by the Holocaust. Reimann, who spent his childhood in Nazi Berlin and the post-war years in West Germany, personally knew Celan, setting many of his poems, including Kumi Ori. This work expresses Reimann's hope that Germany's Judeocide would never happen again. He used the poems Es stand, Denk dir, and Du sei wie du, and excerpts from Psalms 74, 79, and 122, aiming at a, quote, German-Hebrew lingual symbiosis, end quote. He said the first poem in Hebrew and German and used biblical texts mostly in Hebrew. Alternating Hebrew and German throughout, the cycle is named after Celan's quote of the Hebrew Kumi Ori, arise and shine, from Isaiah, in Du sei wie du. Dating from the 1960s, the poems stem from Celan's Jerusalem cycle and obliquely address the Holocaust. As Stand evokes Jerusalem's boat sculpture honoring the Danes' 1943 rescue of Jews. In Denk dir, the phrases Pietbog soldier, barbed wire, and the unburiable remind of concentration camps, and hand and name recall the Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial. Reflecting the Six-Day War, the poem also suggests Zionism through Masada, a symbol of Jewish survival. In Du sei wie du, the slashed bond and swallowing of mud point to Holocaust experiences, and rising Jerusalem and Kumi Ori imply hope in Israel's strength. Reimann emphasizes many of Celan's pointers and embeds Celan's and the biblical text in a seamless declamatory setting, ensuring text comprehensibility. Only occasional melismas underscore keywords or invoke Jewish liturgical music, as in Kumi Ori's unaccompanied metrically free opening. The voice is supported by chamber-like instrumental textures, except in the dramatic third and fourth parts of the five-part work. Framed by Celan's setting, remembering the Holocaust, the central part features Psalm verses 79, 1 and 3, and 74, 8, eerily prefiguring the Holocaust. Quote, God, your inheritance has fallen to the heathens. They are burning your sanctuary and all the houses of God in the land, and they have shed blood about Jerusalem like water, end quote. These texts are declaimed in jagged, dissonant intervals and underscored by strident string clusters and glissandos, vociferous wind motifs, and harsh percussion accents to stress the severe events. In the last 15 bars, however, a rising chromatic cluster of string harmonics highlighting the words Kumi Ori replaces the dark sounds. Yet the ending, expressing hope for a new Jewish-German symbiosis, is imperfect, as the cluster falls short of its completing the 12-tone aggregate by one note, a C sharp, indicating that this goal still lies in the future. And here I have another. Commemoration is a good example of an implicit Holocaust memorial which recalls the Jewish genocide through poetic and biblical texts in a narrative fashion. Yet while Celan's language skills and German Jewish identity and Reimann's longing for close German-Jewish affiliations are stressed, the use of biblical texts as a harbinger of the Holocaust can falsely suggest that the crimes were due to theistic determinism. Buttressing the verse's emotional content through musical gestures of sorrow, anger, and mourning clearly expresses Reimann's own shame and humility. But the piece's redemptory ending may dispel the uneasiness relegating the Holocaust into the distant past. Commemoration was premiered in Hamburg in 2000, performed in several other German cities, and recorded on the Naxos label. Conceived in 2008 by the Berlin-based Boris Hegenbarth and Volker Strebel, the sound installation 9/11/1938 is among the most recent musical Holocaust memorials. Born in 1969, both Hegenbarth and Strebel specialize in sound art. 9/11/1938 was their first collaboration and created for the sound art competition of Collegium Hungaricum in Berlin, honoring Kristallnacht's 70th anniversary. The work's title refers to Kristallnacht's date, but also connotes the day of the terror attacks in New York. Believing that an illustrative representation of the 1938 pogroms would, quote, play down the genocide, end quote, Hegenbarth and Strebel addressed the void created through the annihilation of Jews conceptually. The installation has a visual and silent night and an acoustic day part. Both parts thematicize the void in European life resulting from the Holocaust. In the night part, a camera on Collegium Hungaricum's north side projects the nocturnal empty space of Bauhofstrasse on a large window on the building's south side. And you have a picture. The day part uses recorded street noise from Dorotheenstraße on Collegium Hungaricum's south side and the so-called Kristallnachtfugue, a 13-bar, three-part counterpoint fragment that Schoenberg composed in California after Kristallnacht. And we will listen. is. Schönbeck's dismissal from the Prussian Academy and flight to America created a void in Berlin's music scene. In the installation, street noise on the south facade is the basis. Serving as a template to filter out frequency bands, the fugue is slowed down, an eighth note equaling 25 seconds, to make it sonically compatible with the noise, and the system eliminates the fugue to symbolize the absence of Jews. Through loudspeakers in Collegium Hungaricum's interior, the soundscape with the fugue's negative version was heard in a 2-channel version on the first floor. The removed fugue was heard in a 6-channel version in a staircase, with the first voice sounding on the first, the second on the second, and the third on the third floor. The 43-minute fugue was repeated constantly through Collegium Hungaricum's opening hours. And I have here another little excerpt. Although it's hard to get a real impression of what it sounded like. Like in John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the void is here the focus, and connections are drawn between art and everyday life. Yet the acoustic void created through the Schönbeck template signifies not only the hole ripped into European life 70 years ago, but also the gap felt today. With its Holocaust theme, 9/11/1938 is a rarity among sound installations, earned the first prize in Collegium Hungaricum's competition, and praised for its conceptual rigor and economy. It was also deemed incomprehensible and displeasing by conservative audiences. Recent German musical responses to the Holocaust have been manifold and reflect temporal, geographical, and political contexts and aesthetic and philosophical convictions. Each composer explicitly or implicitly grappled with the remembrance of the incomprehensible Judeocide differently and offered new ways for collective commemoration. Katz's documentarist piece points to traumatic realism in its montage of archival materials and electronics. Despite redemptive moments, it is the most unsettling of the three works, and its ending with Thomas Mann critiquing the Germans is anti-redemptory. Using pictorial means and a redemptive ending, Reimann draws on memorial pedagogies to aim for a better tomorrow, yet runs the risk of mythologizing the Holocaust. His use of Old Testament text foreshadowing the Nazi crimes is also contentious, as it can deceptively alleviate German responsibility. For Hegenbarth and Strebel, the Holocaust is not representable. Thus, they offer in their anti-realist approach neither narrative nor pictures and relate the losses of the Holocaust to the present day with no redemptory promises. All works may raise such concerns as the suitability of descendants of Nazi culprits as authors of Holocaust memorials, the appropriateness of applause and of reaping benefits from performances recalling Norman Finkelstein's critique of a Holocaust industry. Such issues notwithstanding, Holocaust remembrance must remain vital in Germany's life and consciousness, not least to counter rising anti-Semitism. Despite the rightist view of the Holocaust as a sufficiently studied matter, it is still insufficiently understood, while losing its immediacy with the fading of primary witnesses. Thus, Katzer, Reimann, Hegenbart, and Strebel filled gaps within Germany's Holocaust memorial culture and will hopefully find many more followers. Thank you.